Hello, this is Professor Scott Norman in the Pittsburgh State University Automotive Technology Lab, and today we are diagnosing a suspected air conditioning restricted system. And so take a look at the gauge readings. You know, the low side is down fairly low, almost into a vacuum. The high side, I have to turn around and look at this and see what it is. The high side is at around 70, 80. And the low side is almost into a vacuum. The car is not blowing cold air, the air conditioning is on, the compressor is running, all the lines feel dead. So when you take a look at these readings, the first thing you think about is that, hey, it looks undercharged. Well, it came in and technicians charged the vehicle last week. It's still having a problem, and so these are the gauge readings that we have right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about restricted systems, AC systems, and how to properly diagnose an AC system that is restricted. And so what's hard about a restriction in an AC system is that it can be anywhere in the system, and your gauge readings will change depending upon where your high side and low side service ports are. So on this particular vehicle, the high side service port is in the liquid line, and the low side service port is in the suction line. And so by looking at these gauge readings, as far as the low being as low as it is, I'm suspecting a restricted low side of the system, and probably the TXV, probably what it is. And so I wanted to go through a couple of different diagnoses we could do to confirm that there is a restriction in the system. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to shut off the system, and we're going to do an equalization test, and we're going to see how long it takes for the system to equalize. And so I have a timer I'm going to start up, and I'm going to stop the vehicle, and we are going to watch the equalization time, and I'll come back as it equalizes out. Okay, so it has been 32 minutes of turning the system off and looking to see if the system would equalize. And so after 32 minutes, the low side is, around 20 PSI. The high side maybe went down to about maybe 70 or something like that. So after 30 minutes, the system is not equalized. On every TXV I've ever tested, the system has at least equalized fairly close by 30 minutes. And so again, this is a very highly suspected system for being restricted. And again, I'm suspecting that the TXV or somewhere in the low side, it could be the actual evaporator is a restricted, but the TXV is definitely a more likely component. So the next thing we could do to help validate this restriction is we could go ahead and recover the refrigerant, because again, the low gauge readings could possibly be an undercharged condition, but I doubt it. And so when I recover, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to close. Sorry, I'm only going to open the high side service port, and I'm going to leave the low side service port closed. And so right now, in fact, now what we could do real quick is we could go ahead and equalize both systems. So I'm going to open up both the valves, and that way both systems are going to read the same. It will just make it easier for us to determine that there is a problem in the system. And so I'm going to go ahead and close the low side, keep the high side open, and I'm going to start the recovery process. And so you heard the recovery process kick on. And so on a normal system, I should be able to recover all the refrigerant just from one side, either the high side or the low side. And so if I recover all the refrigerant out of the high side, but the low side is still showing pressure, then again, that is another indication of a restriction in the system. And so we're going to let the machine do its work, and we're going to come back and we're going to see what the results are. We recovered the refrigerant from this vehicle in which we thought there was a restriction, and because the gauge readings looked low, and so it was properly charged. So this vehicle was not low charged, and so an additional test we could run is that you can see by the gauges I have the refrigerant removed, but I haven't started the evacuation process yet. So what I could do is that I could close my low side gauge, like what I have right here. My high side gauge is open, and I'm going to start the evacuation process. So let me hit the button over here. You can hear the vacuum pump kick on. And so what I'm doing is that I'm pulling a vacuum on the high side, and I'm seeing if the low side is going to be able to read a gauge reading. And so if there's a restriction in the system, I could do this either through recovery, I could do this through evacuation, I could do this through recharging, where I'm only doing a recovery, evacuation, or recharging on one side and watching the other gauge reading to see if it moves. And if it doesn't, that indicates that there is a restriction in the system. And so we're going to let this sit for just a little bit, and we're going to take a look at the vacuum readings, and we're going to see what they do. So after a few minutes of evacuation, you can see that the low side gauge hasn't really moved at all. It's been around, 17, 18 inches of vacuum, has not dropped below 20 inches of vacuum at all, which it should during a evacuation process. Let's go ahead and let's open up this valve now, and let's see what happens to the gauge. And so immediately I see it moving. I'm gonna have to walk around to the front to see where it's at. But immediately it's dropping past 20, going to 27, 28, 29. So again, this is another indication that there is a restriction in the system. Another test you could run to determine if you have a restriction or not is you could try charging the system on just one side. So right now I have the low manifold valve closed, the high side manifold is open, and I am charging the system on just the high side. So if you notice, the high side is showing pressure, but the low side is still showing a vacuum, which is indicating a restriction in the system. The gauge reading should be going up together, and it's not. So again, this is another test you can run to help determine that yes, there is a restriction in the system. Right now my charge is complete, and all my refrigerant is on the high side of the system, and nothing is on the low side. So we recovered all the refrigerant out of the system, and our next step in this process will be to pull the TXV off the H valve and see if that's restricted. You could take one and you could have it off, and you could blow air in the bottom port. You could blow your through it. And if you cannot blow any air through it at all, then again, you have confirmed that it is restricted. And so again, on this particular scenario, we thought there was a restriction in the low side by number one, looking at the gauge readings and seeing how low they were. The low side was almost into a vacuum, and then the high side was also low. Two, when we did the equalization test and turned the system off, the system did not equalize, at least for a half an hour. We let the system sit, and again, equalization was not taking place. And then third and fourth is that if you try to recover, or if you do a recharge, or if you evacuate only on one side and the other side does not respond, then that is another indication of a restriction in the system. So again, there's lots of different ways to test for an actual restriction. This is Scott Norman, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. And if you're looking for any more automotive educational videos, you could look at my Professor Pintane YouTube channel. I'm also on Facebook, and I have a website. Just look for professorpintane.com. Thank you very much. You guys have a good day.